December 1475. On top of a limestone cliff in Crimea, a man stands alone. His name is Alexander Gabras, Prince of Theodoro. He is, without knowing it, the last Roman. Not Roman in the sense of citizenship, not Roman in some symbolic way. Roman in the most literal sense possible. The last ruler of a land that could trace its lineage directly, unbroken, back to the Roman Empire itself. In 72 hours, everything will end. Rome will fall for the last time. And almost nobody will remember. This is the story of how the final chapter of 2,000 years of history closed in blood and fire. A story of impossible resistance, of a siege that lasted longer than the fall of Constantinople itself, of a prince who held out against the same cannons that destroyed the greatest city in the world. A story that history forgot. Until now. September 1475. 3 months earlier. The morning sun rises over the fortress of Theodoro, illuminating its massive limestone walls. From the highest tower, you can see for miles. The green valleys of Crimea stretch toward the Black Sea. Merchants travel the roads below, carrying goods from the Genoese ports to the interior. Children play in the streets of the lower town. Everything seems normal. But on the horizon, something moves. Prince Alexander Gabras stands on the walls, watching. He's 42 years old, strong, experienced in the delicate politics of surviving between greater powers. For years, he's maintained Theodoro's independence through careful diplomacy. Alliance with the Genoese, tribute to the Crimean Tatars, trade with everyone. It's worked. For decades, it's worked. But now, looking at the dust rising on the southern road, Alexander knows something has changed. A rider approaches at full speed. He's covered in dust and sweat. His horse is exhausted. Alexander descends from the walls to meet him. The message is brief. Catastrophic. Caffa has fallen, the greatest Genoese city in the Black Sea, the commercial hub of the entire region. Fallen in 4 days to an Ottoman army led by Gedik Ahmed Pasha. But there's more. Sudak has fallen, the Genoese fortress where Alexander's allies held power, gone. And now, the Ottoman army is marching north, toward Theodoro. Alexander looks at his advisors. They're silent. Everyone knows what this means. The Ottomans don't come to negotiate. They come to conquer. And they bring with them the same cannons that broke the walls of Constantinople 22 years ago. For a moment, nobody speaks. The weight of the situation settles over everyone like a heavy fog. Then Alexander makes his decision. Close the gates. Recall everyone from the countryside. Bring all supplies into the fortress. Send messengers to anyone who might help us. He pauses. We're going to fight. His advisors look at him. Some nod. Others look terrified. One speaks up. My lord, Constantinople had 10,000 defenders and fell in 53 days. We have perhaps 3,000 soldiers. How long can we possibly hold? Alexander looks at the man. As long as it takes. Before we continue with this story, a quick request. If you're enjoying this so far and want more people to discover these forgotten chapters of history, help the channel grow with a like. And if you want more stories like this, stories that nobody else is telling, subscribe and hit the bell icon. It really helps me continue bringing you this content. Now let's go back to Theodoro. To understand why this siege matters so much, you need to understand what Theodoro actually was. The Principality of Theodoro, also called Gothia by some. A tiny Christian state perched on the southwestern coast of Crimea. Most people have never heard of it. But Theodoro was special. It traced its origins back to the empire of Trebizond, which itself was a remnant of the Byzantine Empire. When Constantinople fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the Byzantine world shattered into fragments. Trebizond was one of those fragments, and Theodoro was a fragment of that fragment. By 1475, Theodoro was the last place on Earth that could legitimately claim to be a continuation of Rome itself. Think about that for a moment. Not a symbolic continuation, not a cultural heir, an actual direct political descendant of the Roman Empire. The Gabrus family, Alexander's family, governed from their capital at Mangup, the fortress we now call Theodoro. They maintained their Greek language, their Orthodox faith, their Roman administrative traditions. The principality was small, maybe 15,000 people total, but it was strategically important. Located at a crossroads of trade routes, Theodoro connected the Genoese ports on the coast with the Tatar kingdoms of the interior. Caravans passed through its lands. Taxes filled its treasury. For a tiny state surrounded by greater powers, Theodoro had survived remarkably well. The fortress itself was nearly impregnable. Mangup sat atop a massive limestone plateau, rising over 1,000 feet above the surrounding plains. Steep cliffs on all sides made direct assault almost impossible. Massive stone walls, built and rebuilt over centuries, protected the few vulnerable approaches. Inside, there were churches, homes, workshops, warehouses full of supplies. It had survived attacks before: Tatar raids, Genoese pressure, internal conflicts. But it had never faced anything like what was coming. Gedik Ahmed Pasha was not just any commander. He was one of Sultan Mehmed II's most trusted generals, the same Mehmed who conquered Constantinople, the same Mehmed whose armies now controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and were pushing into Europe itself. Ahmed Pasha brought with him the full might of the Ottoman military machine, tens of thousands of soldiers, janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, Sipahi cavalry, engineers who had studied under the masters who broke Constantinople. And most terrifyingly, artillery, the same type of massive bronze. Cannons that had pulverized the Theodosian walls, walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, would now turn their fury on Theodoro. Alexander knew all of this. He knew the odds. He knew that asking for help was probably futile. The Genoese were finished in the region. The Tatars were either allied with the Ottomans or too weak to intervene. The Italian states were far away and preoccupied with their own wars. Theodoro stood alone, but Alexander also knew something else, something that gave him a sliver of hope. Mangup had never fallen to a direct assault, ever. Its natural defenses were simply too strong. Any enemy trying to storm the walls would have to climb steep slopes under constant arrow and stone fire. The approaches were narrow, easily defended. If Theodoro could hold out long enough, maybe the Ottomans would give up. Maybe winter would come and force them to withdraw. Maybe something would change. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope they had. September turned to October. The Ottoman army arrived. From the walls of Mangup, the defenders watched as Ahmed Pasha's forces spread across the valleys below like a dark flood. Tents by the thousands, cavalry units, supply wagons stretching to the horizon, and the guns. Massive bronze cannons, each one requiring dozens of oxen to move. They were positioned carefully, set up on reinforced platforms, aimed at the fortress walls. The siege of Theodoro had begun. The first bombardment started at dawn. The sound was unlike anything most defenders had ever heard. A thunderous roar that shook the earth itself. Cannonballs, some weighing over half a ton, flew through the air and crashed into the limestone walls. Rock exploded. Dust filled the air. Men screamed. But the walls held. This was the peculiar nature of Mangup's defenses. The fortress wasn't built on earth or soft stone. It was carved into and built upon solid limestone, a plateau that had taken millions of years to form. Ottoman cannons that could breach conventional walls in days found themselves pounding against something far more resilient. Days turned into weeks. The bombardment continued relentlessly. Every morning the guns roared. Every evening the defenders counted their dead and repaired what they could. Alexander was everywhere, on the walls, encouraging his men, in the churches, praying with the people, in council meetings, managing supplies, planning defenses. Food was already becoming a concern. Theodoro had prepared for a siege, but nobody expected it to last this long. Water was less of a problem, as there were springs inside the fortress, but rationing began anyway. Morale was the real challenge. Every day, the defenders could see the vast Ottoman army below. Every night they could see the campfires stretching across the valley. The psychological weight of facing such overwhelming force began to press down on everyone. Ahmed Pasha, meanwhile, was growing frustrated. He had expected Theodoro to fall quickly, just like Kaffa and Sudak. A few days of bombardment, a breach in the walls, a final assault. Standard procedure. But Mangup was different. The limestone plateau absorbed the cannon fire in ways conventional fortifications couldn't. Where a normal wall would shatter and collapse, the solid rock simply cracked and held. The Ottoman engineers tried different approaches. They attempted to mine under the walls, digging tunnels to collapse the defenses from below. But the limestone was too hard, too deep. The tunnels collapsed before they could reach their targets. They tried building siege towers to scale the cliffs, but the approaches were too narrow and steep. Defenders rained down arrows, stones, and burning oil on anyone who got close. They tried direct assault, waves of soldiers attempting to storm the few vulnerable gates. But the defenders, fighting for their homes and families, repelled every attack with desperate courage. October became November, 2 months into the siege. Inside Theodoro, life had become a daily struggle for survival. Food supplies were running critically low. Horses had been slaughtered for meat weeks ago. Anything remotely edible was carefully rationed. Disease began to spread: dysentery, typhus. In the close quarters of the besieged fortress, sickness killed as many as Ottoman weapons. Alexander watched his people suffer and made impossible decisions every day. Who gets food? How much? When do we surrender to save lives? Should we try a desperate breakout? But surrender wasn't really an option. Everyone knew what happened to cities that surrendered to Mehmed after long resistance. Constantinople's surrender terms had been harsh. Theodoro, having held out even longer, could expect worse. So they continued fighting. The defenders had one advantage. They knew every stone, every passage, every defensive position of their fortress. When the Ottomans finally breached a section of wall in early November, the defenders fell back to prepared positions and turned the breach itself into a killing ground. Ahmed Pasha lost hundreds of men trying to exploit that breach before finally giving up and returning to bombardment. This story only gets more intense from here. If you're following along and want more people to know about Alexander Gabras and Theodoro, share this video. Send it to that friend who loves forgotten history, and leave a comment. If you were in Alexander's position, would you surrender to save your people or fight to the end? I want to know what you think. Continuing. November became December, 3 months into the siege. By now, Theodoro was dying. Not from direct assault, but from slow starvation and disease. The population inside the fortress had been reduced by a third. Not from combat, but from hunger and sickness. Alexander himself was gaunt, exhausted. He hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time in months. Every decision weighed on him. Every death felt personal. His advisors began approaching him, one by one, with the same message. We can't hold much longer. We need to negotiate. We need to surrender while we still have something to bargain with. Alexander refused. He knew that surrender now meant slavery for his people, execution for himself, and the total erasure of Theodoro from existence. But he also knew they couldn't hold forever. The turning point came in the second week of December. Ahmed Pasha changed tactics. Instead of trying to breach the walls, he focused all his artillery on a single tower that guarded the main approach to the fortress. For 3 days straight, every cannon fired at this one position. The tower had stood for centuries, but even limestone has limits. On the third day, the tower collapsed. Not just damaged, completely destroyed. With the tower gone, a new approach to the walls was exposed. The defenders rushed to fortify it, but they were exhausted, malnourished, and running out of materials. Ahmed Pasha ordered a full assault. December 18th, 1475. Just before dawn, Ottoman forces launched their final attack on Theodoro. Thousands of soldiers, fresh and well-fed, surged up the approaches that the fallen tower had once guarded. The defenders, numbering perhaps 1,000 men still capable of fighting, met them at the walls. What followed was desperate, brutal, close-quarters combat. Swords, spears, stones, anything that could be used as a weapon. The defenders fought with the fury of men protecting their last homes. For hours, they held the line. Bodies piled up on both sides, but there were simply too many Ottomans, too many fresh troops, too many waves. By midday, Ottoman soldiers had reached the top of the walls. Alexander, fighting alongside his men, saw that the battle was lost. The fortress would fall. The only question now was how many more would die before the end. Some sources say he ordered a final retreat into the inner citadel, hoping to hold out just a bit longer. Other accounts suggest the Ottomans used a ruse, a false retreat followed by a sudden ambush that caught the exhausted defenders off guard. What we know for certain is this. By evening on December 18, 1475, Ottoman banners flew over Theodoro. The siege was over. Alexander Gabras was captured. Most of his remaining soldiers were killed or enslaved. The civilian population that had survived the 3-month ordeal faced a grim fate. Many were sold into slavery. Some were allowed to leave, becoming refugees scattered across the Black Sea region. A few converted to Islam and remained under Ottoman rule. The fortress itself, the nearly impregnable Mangup, was occupied by an Ottoman garrison. Over time, it would decay and eventually be abandoned. Today, its ruins on a hilltop in Crimea, visited by tourists who have no idea of the epic siege that took place there. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. Remember how I mentioned Constantinople at the beginning? The greatest city in the world, defended by 10,000 men, fell after 53 days of siege. Theodoro, a tiny fortress with 3,000 defenders, held out for over 90 days, 3 months, against the same army, the same cannons, the same engineers. Constantine XI became a legend for his defense of Constantinople. Alexander Gabras is barely a footnote in history books. Why? Because Constantinople was the symbolic heart of Christendom. Its fall shocked Europe. It became the subject of countless chronicles, poems, and histories. Theodoro was just a small principality in Crimea, remote, unimportant to the major European powers. When it fell, barely anyone noticed. But in terms of pure military achievement, Alexander Gabras' defense of Theodoro was arguably more impressive than Constantine's defense of Constantinople. And yet, we remember one and forget the other. December 1475 marked the end of something profound. With the fall of Theodoro, the last political entity that could trace its lineage directly back to Rome ceased to exist. People often say that Rome fell in 476 AD when the last Western emperor was deposed, or in 1453 when Constantinople fell. But that's not quite accurate. Rome, in the form of Theodoro, survived until December 1475. That's 2,228 years. From the traditional founding of Rome in 753 BC to the fall of Theodoro in 1475 AD. Over 2 millennia of continuous political existence. and it ended on a limestone plateau in Crimea with a prince nobody remembers, defending a fortress against impossible odds. Today, more than 5 centuries later, what's left of Theodoro? The ruins of Mangup still stand, perched on their plateau. Archaeologists have excavated parts of the site, uncovering churches, homes, defensive walls. It's a beautiful, haunting place, but there's no grand memorial, no statue of Alexander Gabras, no monument recognizing that this was where Rome, after 2,000 years, finally ended. The Gabras family vanished from history. Some members may have escaped and lived out their lives in obscurity. Others certainly died in the siege or its aftermath. The Crimean Khanate, which became an Ottoman vassal after 1475, would control the region for centuries. The fortress of Mangup was used as a prison and minor garrison point, but never regained its former importance. Ironically, Mehmed II never set foot in Theodoro. He was preparing for his grand invasion of Italy when the fortress fell. To him, it was just another conquest, barely worth mentioning in his chronicles. But for historians, for anyone who appreciates human courage and resilience, the siege of Theodoro should be remembered alongside the great defensive stands of history: Thermopylae, Masada, the Alamo, Constantinople. Add Theodoro to that list, a tiny fortress, holding out for 3 months against a vastly superior force. Defenders who knew they would lose but fought anyway. A prince who refused to surrender even when surrender might have saved lives. Was Alexander Gabras right to resist to the end? That's a question historians still debate. Some argue he was heroic, defending his people's freedom and Rome's legacy to the last. Others say he was stubborn, sacrificing his people's lives for a lost cause. There's no easy answer. What we can say with certainty is this: Alexander Gabras and the defenders of Theodoro displayed extraordinary courage. They deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. And now you know it. This was the story of Alexander Gabras, Prince of Theodoro, the last Roman, a story of impossible resistance, of a siege that lasted longer than the fall of Constantinople, of the final end of 2,000 years of Roman history. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Leave a comment. Did you know about Theodoro before this video? What do you think Alexander should have done differently? I want to hear your thoughts. Next week, I'm telling the story of the Ottoman invasion of Italy itself. What happened when Mehmed II finally turned his armies toward Rome, the city where it all began? It's even more dramatic than you think. Until then. Some stories echo forever, even when we forget to listen.